everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Annette Benbow, and I'm chair of the events committee in the Arlington Historical Society. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. I thought before I give an introduction to our speaker tonight, I would tell you a couple things that are going to be going on in the next couple of weeks or so, just to let you stew about that and plan on how to get there. So this Saturday, yes, just 2 days from now, on the 13th, the Arlington Historical Museum is hosting an open house because it is unveiling a new exhibit just in time for the holidays. It's called Stirring Up Memories, Arlington Cookbooks. All right, thanks to hundreds, it seemed, people, we have so many cookbooks that we wanted to show people the collection. So they have loaned it, they have donated it, and we have a slew of cookbooks which tell a unique part of Arlington history. They represent churches, synagogues, schools, libraries, service clubs. You name it, there's a cookbook for it. And each one tells a different story about the owner and the organization. So that's Saturday, 1 to 4 p.m. at the Arlington Historical Museum up on South Arlington Ridge Road. An added plus is that volunteers from the Arlington Historical Society are going to be making items for you to eat that are in the cookbooks, and we'll have the recipes for you to take home if you like it. So imagine a mock apple pie. What might that taste like? So we'll have that for you to sample. So that's again this Saturday, just 2 days away from 1 to 4 at the Arlington Historical Museum. The next monthly event, like the one you're witnessing tonight, is on December 9th. Again, it's the second Thursday of every month. And it is the last one in 2021, because that's what happens in December. So we are going to be talking about the history of Ashton Heights with Peter Dixon. He's a longtime resident and local historian, and he's written a book about it. And he is going to be discussing how this neighborhood got started, its architecture, and some of the more interesting and celebrated residents who live there. So it's right here in the library auditorium on Thursday, December 9th at 7 p.m. Okay, that's enough PSAs for the moment. Come on in, come on in. Hi. There's a mask on the table. That's an excellent point. He's my PSA. Yes, we are the guests of Marymount University. So thank you for wearing your masks, and thank you for doing social distancing whenever possible. So thank you. Okay, now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Charlie Clark. He is recently retired from journalism, but he's still the author of the column Our Man in Arlington, published in the Falls Church News Press. Charlie is a longtime member of the Arlington Historical Society, and we are thrilled to have him as a new member of the board of directors. In his Arlington column, his Man in Arlington column, he has captured the histories of many Arlington homes, lots of people, events, even current events. But this book that he's going to be talking about tonight, about George Washington Parke Custis, is the first full-length book on a single individual. And he will give us a perspective on this gentleman from the 21st century vantage point. Charlie, please help me welcome Charlie.
So pleased to be here. Somewhere in my book, I say that George Washington Parke Custis is the closest thing we have to a founder of Arlington County. And but that doesn't mean that he is a great man whose life we should all emulate. So, but he's important is all I can say. Let's see, Custis lived, let's see, Mark, is this going? I thought it was these arrows. Yeah, it seems to be frozen. Pardon me just a second.
Small technical problem.
We have more than slides than just this one. There we go. Okay,
Unfrozen.
thank you. So it's an impactful, unique life. Custis knew the first 15 presidents. I don't think there's many people you can say that about. And his years from 1781 to 1857 is really a symbolic bridge between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. He shows up, he's not as well known as Robert E. Lee. But he shows up in every book on biography of George Washington and every biography of Robert E. Lee. But it's usually a kind of a cameo appearance, and he's a little bit cardboard. His sister, Nellie Custis, who, like him, grew up at Mount Vernon, adopted by George Washington and their natural grandmother, Martha. She's been the subject of several biographies. So he's best known, of course, for building our Arlington House. He used both enslaved and free labor to do so, 1802 to about 1818. And of course, it is the reason that our county has its name. I'm going to let you all look at some of the key events of his life while I continue talking. So the reason I wanted to do this book is that it was very much time for a more modern treatment of the slavery issue and how it was handled at Arlington House. And that handling of it, because of his relationship with both George Washington and Robert E. Lee, makes it a national issue. His former home in 1955 was renamed by Congress as dedicated to Robert E. Lee. It was our own local Congressman, Joel Broyhill, who introduced that resolution. And it was updated in 1972, where they actually put Lee's name on it. The official name of it is Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial. And of course, Congressman Don Beyer has a bill that he's soon to reintroduce that would remove Lee's name from it, and it would go back to just being Arlington House. And then in Arlington House closed in 2017, having received a $12 million grant from the philanthropist David Rubenstein. And they revamped and modernized the exhibitions to better document the members of the enslaved community at Arlington House. And they downplayed Lee somewhat, not as much as some people would like. So that's still an ongoing issue. And Lee, of course, as you all know, anybody who's followed renamings in Arlington knows that Lee himself and the takedowns of some of these statues, that Lee himself is undergoing what I call it a 21st century demotion. So the other thing I noticed that there really has not been a biography of George Washington Parke Custis. So I decided that as a journalist, not being a scholar of the early American period, but being fancying myself as a pretty good researcher, was able to pull the material all together for the first time. Custis' parents, you have his father was John Parke Custis, called Jackie, and his mother was Eleanor Calvert. She's a Marylander, descended from the original royal governors of Maryland. John Parke Custis was the son of Martha Washington and Daniel Parke Custis. Daniel Parke Custis, very wealthy Virginia planter, he dies 1754. And Martha Washington then, of course, remarries to George Washington in 1759. And Jackie and Eleanor had 4 children, the 4 Custis siblings, Eliza Parke, Martha Parke, Eleanor Parke, who's called Nellie, and the youngest was the son, George Washington Parke Custis. He was born at Mount Airy, which you can still visit today, although it too has been closed by the pandemic. I sort of snuck onto the property to get this picture, but it's right near this Rosaryville State Park there in Prince George's County. And this is also where his parents were married. And then Jackie Custis dies in October of 1781, right after the Battle of Yorktown. He died of camp fever. And so George Washington and Martha Washington adopt the young Custis. He was about 6 months old when he moved to Mount Vernon. And with Nellie, and the two older daughters stayed with their mother. And she would remarry David Stewart, and they lived out in Hope Park, which is a place in Fairfax. So being raised in Mount Vernon, of course, this is a life of privilege. And just the existence of these portraits shows you how affluent and rarefied, which is the title I use in my book, the word I use in my book. This is one of the most famous ones by Edward Savage. He originally was posed for in about 1789, but it took him about 6-7 years to finalize it. And then it was distributed around the country as an engraving, like postcard size. So this is really where Washi, who's there on the left with his hand on a globe, which I consider sort of symbolic of their high hopes for him. But this is what would make him a household name too. Now, here's the issue though, and raised in all that privilege, he was sent away to college and didn't do so well. And this is a quote from George Washington about his indolence. And, I think he was probably distracted by the female companions in the towns of, he was at Princeton, which is called the College of New Jersey at the time. And then he was in Annapolis at St. John's College, which of course is still there today. Now, there's, in the gentry of Virginia society in that period, there are plenty of success stories of the children of the founding fathers who did really well. The best example is the Adams family, and JQA becomes president after his father was president. The opposite fate is a good example is Todd Payne was the adopted son of James Madison. And he disappointed everybody by kind of dissipating his life in gambling and drink. So, it was a temptation for these upper crust young men who were handed a lot of advantages to squander it. And you should also make a note that George Washington doted on Nellie Custis, but Martha Washington doted on Washi, as he was called. So I like to think that in my book, I've done the most comprehensive account of this dramatic exchange of letters between George Washington and Custis, both when he was at College of New Jersey and when he was in Annapolis. And they talk about very mundane things like who the landlady is and what clothing he needs and tuition payments, but they also talk about his coursework and exactly which scholars. And of course, you remember that George Washington did not have a formal education himself, so he had created a very impressive library and had high hopes that both his stepson, Jackie Custis, and then later his step-grandson would make good use of it. So we'll see what happens. But so he basically, he's kicked out of Princeton and he flunks out of St. John's. So he comes back to Mount Vernon and lives a little more of the high life. And in 1799, Washington's last year, there's a threat of a war with France. So the new army had to be created, and George Washington in retirement was the official commander in chief of the new army. Fortunately, the war never really occurred, but Custis was Washington arranged with Secretary of War James McHenry to give Custis a rank. Eventually, it was a cornet, and Washington in the letters is saying, "I don't want any special treatment. I don't want anybody to know about this, but I'd like you to give him a rank." And then later he says, "I'd like to give him the fanciest uniforms and weaponry that you can." So Custis at this time is aware that he's due to inherit quite an estate. And you got to remember that the Custis line, it goes back several generations to Williamsburg and to Arlington Plantation, which is where Arlington House took its name. That's down on the eastern shore near Cape Charles. And so his great grandparents were also wealthy. And you got to remember the Custis name until around maybe the 1770s and 80s, the Custis name has higher status than the Washington name would be at this time. So, but he inherits, so George Washington dies in 1799, December, and in his will, Custis gets 1,200 acres that is part of Arlington County today. And then Martha Washington dies almost 2 years later in May of 1802. And he gets some more items from her, as well as almost 200 slaves. Now those slaves didn't all go to him at first. There's some disagreement about the exact division between those four Custis siblings and the Peter family and the Law family and the Lewis family, that's Nellie's husband. They all took some of those enslaved persons, and some of them were sold and traded. And but in the end, Custis ends up with about 200, and that's about 60 or so at Arlington House, and then about 135 or 40 down in east of Richmond on the Pamunkey River, 2 plantations there. So, basically he's a de facto aristocrat. He decides to build Arlington House, which was, you got to remember, was a tribute to George Washington. The original name of it was called Mount Washington before he changed his mind because somebody else had taken Mount Washington. And he recruited one of the top architects of the period, which was George Hadfield, who had helped design the U.S. Capitol. He didn't run that show. That was William Thornton, but he did design City Hall in D.C. and one of the courthouses. And Custis wanted to imitate his ancestors by building a Greek Doric column theme, a Greek revival themed mansion on this 200-foot bluff. And he used the Arlington House then to entertain all kinds of important people. He also, during the construction of Arlington House, the enslaved laborers lived in these sort of kind of shack type structures on the riverfront, and he lived in a temporary quarters. It wasn't even that much more luxurious, and he was storing in before Arlington House was habitable. He was storing these relics that he had both inherited from the Washingtons and the Custises, but also things that he had to purchase because they had auctions, and the Custis siblings and other people would buy for different belongings. So he ends up with Martha Washington's books, some china, the bed on which Washington died, and he eventually some paintings, and he eventually ends up with the tent that George Washington used in the Revolutionary War, which we'll get to later. So these are these more portraits, but I wanted to show what he looks like when he's in his teenage years, and then when he's a young man building Arlington House, and they shows him in his military uniform. So Arlington House was then the scene of sheep shearings, competition and that skill and the proceeds, of course, were used for clothing. And Custis was very set on domestic manufacturing, hoping that we wouldn't be so dependent on England for clothing and other items. So he builds Arlington House. It takes about 16 years. Then, of course, he takes a bride, and Molly Fitzhugh had grown up in Fredericksburg at the Chatham plantation, and her father moved the family up here, and they lived on the house on Orinoco Street, which I'll get to in a minute because it figures prominently in this story. And then it was a marriage made, but there were also Lee and Randolph connections in these interlocking. So here's Molly, done in 1807. And they would have 4 children, but 3 of them did not survive. A son named Edward, I think, lived the longest. And so the one who does survive is Mary Custis, who becomes later Mary Custis Lee. Now, the other connection that Molly Custis brings to the marriage, well, let me show you first. Here's the marriage certificate, July 6, 1804. I had to dig this out at the Library of Virginia, and I also had to get permission from the Arlington County Clerk, Paul Ferguson. This is a live document. No, it's the rules. Bishop Meade, if you go to the Episcopal Seminary, you see the Meade room there, and he later became Bishop of Virginia and was as a Episcopal Church reformer, but he was a cousin of Molly Fitzhugh, and that's why I bring him up here. And his own visit to Arlington House, where he saw some of the books that Custis had inherited, inspired him to not cancel his plan to study for the law and to study theology at Princeton. And he and Custis and the rest of the family would work together later on in the American Colonization Society, which I'll talk about a little bit later. There's another portrait of him, 1808, when he's making his mark as a presence in DC. Now, it's interesting that where Lee and George Washington were sort of handsome, soft-spoken, duty-driven, Custis was short, beak-nosed, verbose, paunchy, and playful. So I would call that, he's a little more approachable, I would say. He also possessed a mellifluous voice, and in the age before microphones, so he could enthrall hundreds of people in a room or a public square, which he would do a lot of times on Washington's birthday. And some of his speeches, I'll get into some of that later. He had detractors too, the Jeffersonians, and some people were just tired of him always harping back on George Washington. And he spoke during 4th of July ceremony in 1850 when Zachary Taylor was president. And Custis spoke for so long that Zachary Taylor got sick in the sunlight and went back to the White House and ate a bad meal and died. So we can't link it directly to Custis, but he also weighed in as an essayist and an orator on top tier issues, domestic independence, farming innovation, the collapse of the Federalist Party, the advent of the steamship and the railroad, protection of rights of Irish Catholic immigrants. And he fought for the first federal benefits for war veterans of both the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And at Arlington House, he greeted, advised, and entertained uncounted influential guests. So here's how his daughter Mary would later recall him in the book that they published together. Mr. Custis was of medium height and well-formed, his complexion fair and somewhat florid, his eyes light and expressive of great kindliness of nature, his voice full, rich, and melodious, his deportment graceful and winning, his courtesy to strangers extremely cordial, and his affection for friends warm and abiding. So I guess she has an objective view of him. But now you should also note that though he opposed the U.S. declaration of war against the British in August of 1812, by the time the British troops arrived in 1814, he signed up and did fight at the Battle of Bladensburg for no pay. He was also a farm innovator, both in terms of crops and sheep, different breeds of sheep that he experimented with while Arlington improved. And the current U.S. Agriculture Department has a mention of him on its website, which I find is interesting. Okay, and then he also at this stage began laying the groundwork for the legacy of George Washington and memories of the American Revolution. And so in 1815, with 2 Revolutionary War veterans, they take a schooner trip down the Potomac to Pope's Creek, Virginia, which is the site of what was called Wakefield, the birthplace of George Washington. And they rolled out a stone to mark the spot for the first time. And so I'm indebted to the Temple University scholar Seth Brueggemann for finding this engraving of what was called the first stone around in, this was published, I think, in 1830s, but Custis in later life would help, with the monuments at places like Bunker Hill, and I'll get to another one. So meanwhile, his plantations that he has an overseer running on the Pamunkey River, one is called White House and one is called Roman Coke. And this is a shot of an engraving of it after the Civil War, but I thought it was interesting. And then this is an upsetting document that I found. There was numerous versions of it over the years, the Virginia Historical Society, and there's others at William and Mary, where the enslaved persons are inventoried, and it's put on the same ledger as the livestock. And this is the way they would measure, the assets and the productivity of a farm. And there's also but more humanized footnotes about which of the enslaved persons are maybe sick or whatever. There's a couple of notes about that. You can see that if you read it in the book. And this deals with both Roman Coke and his other plantation. They're in two different counties. Roman Coke was in King William County, and then across the river is where the White House was at New Kent County. Now, in 1824 and 5, the Marquis de Lafayette makes his triumphant grand tour of the United States, the invitation of President James Monroe. And there's a lot of sentimentality because Lafayette knew Washi, he called him Tub. That was another nickname for Custis when he was a little boy. And he remembers him when Custis was just 3 years old. And so I opened the book with a dinner scene at Arlington House, taken from a letter that has really never been published. And it's too bad it's an anonymous letter, but it describes in great detail, and I thought sort of poetic, good imagery of the dinner in October of 1824 at Arlington House, where Lafayette, accompanied by all sorts of dignitaries, came to dinner, and how the Custis relatives all gathered with them, and how the whole evening was set up with the enslaved servants serving the meal and all that. And the other thing that happens on this tour with Lafayette, Custis accompanies him to Mount Vernon and to Fredericksburg and to Yorktown and to Baltimore. And they have good discussions about slavery. Lafayette believed in abolitionism. And so he would remind George Washington of his views on that. And he also reminded Custis. So Custis, by 1824, was already active in the American Colonization Society. And I quote, this is how they debated that issue. But the other important thing about the Lafayette visit is that Custis, who apparently had a photographic memory, he would spend the day with Lafayette and then come home at night and write a bunch of notes. And then he ended up publishing in a series called Conversations of Lafayette. And it was in the Alexandria Gazette, and it was in the National Intelligencer paper too. And that was the beginning of his recollections, which would come out later after he died. The editor of the National Intelligencer was William Seton, who later became mayor of the District of Columbia. It's interesting that he, even though his paper was more pro-Jefferson, he encouraged Custis to write and publish. And he also went into the business of the Congressional Record, the modern, there was different names for it back in the 19th century, but he helped publish Gale's congressional recordings or some name like that. I have to go remind myself. All right, so along in about 1829, 1830, his daughter Mary becomes enamored of Robert E. Lee, and they had really grown up together down. Lee, as you remember, was after he was born in Westmoreland County at Stratford Hall, he was raised in Old Town Alexandria, and the Custises frequented that place. They may have been together at any number of houses there along the way. And of course, the house, let's see, she's married. The house where Custis and Molly were married is the same house that Robert E. Lee grew up in, and it's called Lee's Boyhood Home, and it's there on Orinoco Street. And it's for sale now. I don't know if you all noticed that in the paper. And they also are replacing the sign. For years, it said Lee's Boyhood Home, and it had an anecdote about Lee coming home after the Civil War and sentimentally looking at these snowball flowers in the backyard, but apparently there's no documentation for that, so they removed it. Let's see, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Yeah, here's the home there on Orinoco Street. I was just there the other day looking at it. And it does say on the sign that this was the home. See, Lee's father, Lighthorse Harry, was in bad financial situation. He's the one who spoke at George Washington's funeral and delivered the famous eulogy, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. But he fell into a career collapse. And so he rented the house from Fitzhugh, who's Custis's father-in-law. And so this is where Custis and his wife were married. So then on the issue of continuing the monument building to preserve the legacy of George Washington, he in 1836 arranges with President Andrew Jackson, who Custis had endorsed and befriended. He tended to endorse military heroes, even if they weren't of his Federalist or Whig persuasion. And they arranged, after some discussions with a poetess I talk about in the book and other people that thought it was a crying shame that the tomb of Mary Ball Washington, who's the mother of George Washington, is neglected and in poor shape. So just to remind you, Washington was born at Pope's Creek, and then he's raised at Ferry Farm, which is right on the outskirts of Fredericksburg, and that's where Mary Ball Washington would have raised him. And then she had a house downtown a little bit later, which you can visit today. So Custis was instrumental. They shipped the George Washington's battlefield tent down there, which I'll show you in a minute. And 15,000 people gathered on the historic district of Fredericksburg, which I was down there a few months ago. It is just really deserted. I had it all to myself. But it's right near Kenmore Plantation. And the then owner of Kenmore Plantation, a gentleman named Gordon, is the one who helped finance this new gravestone for Mary Ball Washington. Here's the battlefield tent. You can see it today in Philadelphia, which my wife and I have done. There was actually several accoutrements to it. So there you had a marquee tent and you had a dining tent and a couple of smaller ones. You can see another part of it down in Yorktown today with the National Park Service. And his enslaved domestic helper was Philip Lee, is the one who was in charge of pitching this tent. And Custis would lend it to all kinds of military events throughout the early 19th century, and eventually it got worn out. It was in danger of. So then, from our Arlington local point of view, Custis has several important Arlington connections locally. He wrote to Thomas Jefferson in 1808 and helped situate what would be the Long Bridge, which was opened in 1809. He was a justice of the peace for 20 or 30 years in Old Town Alexandria and in Arlington, what is now Arlington County. And he built a sawmill / grist mill at what today is Columbia Pike and South Columbus Street. There's a car repair shop there that if you want to go down and see where you can hear the water sloshing in the 4 mile run right there, which is where this mill stood. In 1836, he greatly improved it and enlarged it, and he used enslaved labor to operate it as well. And he was always slightly disappointed in its productivity. But this is what it looked like based on an engraving made during the Civil War. And then it was demolished and it replaced by a more modern, huge grist mill by John Barcroft. And he's still a big namesake in Arlington. It lasted until I think the 30s or so, and then it became an ice house there. So this is a couple more portraits. I wanted to give you an example of how Custis would have looked as he aged. Here he is at about 59 on the left, and let's see, we're 48 plus 19, you do the math, a little older. But it just shows you how well connected he is. And all these portraits artists are well known in their field too, and they have their own access to other prominent Americans. So then Custis goes into the business of playwriting, and he was a super patriot. So the first plays he wrote were celebrating George Washington, and that's what this Indian prophecy is about. It's a story that Tobias Lear and others told about when they went back to the French and Indian War battle sites in Kanawha, which is now West Virginia. They ran into an Indian who talked about this very impressive white man on horseback from the Indian War days, and how he was immune to weaponry, arrows. And so he predicted that he would be a great empire leader one day. And that's the source of this play. He wrote some plays, at least one that was set in Scotland, and it was kind of a flop. And people said, why are you deviating from American content, which is, I think, one lesson he learned. But his plays were performed in Boston and Philadelphia and at the National Theater, which opened in DC in 1836, and in Columbia, South Carolina, New York City as well. Some of these sort of strict theater critic types were not impressed, though, and they thought they were kind of corny. The plays had some special effects too. The railroad was brand new, and they had a full-size railroad engine or something that looked like it. Now, interesting that Custis, he attended the Cornerstone layings, both in 1793, the original, and then when an expanded Capitol building was laid into the Cornerstone in 1851, Custis was there too. So he's sort of the Zelig of the 19th century. He was an early member of the American Antiquarian Society, which was formed in 1812. He was rejected in his application to the Society of the Cincinnati, which is the Revolutionary War officers' descendants. First president of that society was George Washington. The second president was Alexander Hamilton. And he did not join the Masons. And of course, George Washington is one of the most famous Masons, and that's why Alexandria has its Masonic temple. And one theory, I talked to some modern Masons about why Custis never joined, is that I report in the book that he was arrested in 1798 for theft of silver spoons from Gadsby's Tavern. And it's a mystery exactly what happened, but it's that we're guessing that may be why. Now, besides playwriting, he also took up painting, and even his own daughter admitted that he wasn't that skillful in the renderings, but people were interested in him because he had a lot of detail from the Revolutionary War battles that was based on his own interviews with not only Washington, but some of the other veterans and officers. And in this Battle of Monmouth, which you can see at Arlington House today, there's also a small image of Molly Pitcher, the legendary female combatant who's shown with a cannon fodder there. He also did a self-portrait, which you can see at Arlington House. And then this painting, my friend Dean DeRosa unearthed, might be a painting that Custis refers to as his equestrian painting. Again, my view, the quality isn't so great, but interesting. Now, this brings us to what is really the most topical aspect of Custis, which is his handling of slavery. These are this is a find from the Virginia Historical Society, a printer's layout of permission slips that enslaved persons would need to have signed in order to leave the property to run various errands around the area. And in one of the interviews with James Parks, who was born there enslaved, but who later went on to work for Arlington Cemetery, said that Custis was very lenient in granting permission, and that he would often give the people some spending money to go on those trips. Now, but obviously, he profited a great deal from ownership of these 200 human beings. And you know, most of them on the Pamunkey River are working out in the hot fields, in livestock and wheat and corn produce. And in Arlington House, you have smaller scale crops, and you have flower gardens that both Molly and Mary Lee Molly Custis and Mary Lee were fond of. And you had the whole kitchen garden arrangement. So what were called house slaves had a much more comfortable life, obviously, than the field slaves. But the most important aspect of Custis's handling of slavery is summed up in the story of Mariah Carter Syphax. And it was just a month ago that my friend Steve Hammond was here discussing it. He's the historian of the Syphax family, the descendants. But she, in 1803, which is before Custis was married, he apparently, and I'll give you the evidence, you know, had relations with Ariana Carter, who was an enslaved woman who had come over from Mount Vernon. This is right when they was just getting going on Arlington House. And the result was the birth of this daughter named Mariah Carter. And she goes on to get permission to marry in 1821 in the parlor of Arlington House, which was very unusual at the time period. It happened one other time with Selina Gray and Thornton Gray, which I'll show you in a minute. And then about 5 years later, in 1826, Custis frees Mariah Syphax. She doesn't, and her children, and gives her 17 acres of land. That 17 acres, as Steve noted last week, is on Fort Myer campus now, right behind the Sheraton Hotel. And it used to be a trolley car stop called Syphax. So that was interesting to learn that recently. And so the evidence that this relations took place, besides, there was lots of rumors that were printed in newspapers too about lots of mixed race children around Arlington House and on the staff. And the fact that he would give her that land and manumit her, the actual manumission took place about 20 years later. Custis often, not often enough, but on numerous occasions, freed some slaves by selling them to Edward Stabler. And if you're in Old Town and you want to go to the old apothecary shop, I've done that recently. That was Edward Stabler. It's called the Stabler Ledbetter shop now. They're on Fairfax Street near Market Square. And they have all sorts of documents, receipts from the Custises and Martha Washington and Nellie Custis, which I quote some of them in the book. But Edward Stabler was a Quaker, and he was an abolitionist. So he would often acquire ownership of these enslaved persons and then manumit them. And so this is what happened with her. And then finally, there's proof that I quote in the book that in the 1880s, early 80s, not long before she died, she gave an interview to Atchison, Kansas newspaper, in which she said that Mr. Custis called me in and told me that I was his daughter, and that Mrs. Lee, who's her sister, treated her very well. And that was pretty good documentation. Now, it's interesting that this would make Mariah Syphax the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington by blood. And of course, remember, George Washington has no natural children, so he gets a dotted line on some of these family trees. Now, in my book, in the family tree, I opted to make it more of an informational chart so you could keep track of all these sound-alike names. But at Arlington House, now in the new exhibit, they have the family tree, and they have a line directly from Mariah Syphax up to Martha Washington, going through 3 generations. So it'll be interesting to see how in the future, when they discuss Martha Washington, whether they talk about Mariah Syphax. And then also there is a hope among some of the modern Syphax descendants to have a DNA test, because Robert E. Lee V is around, and his name has been invoked during all these controversies over the monuments recently. And so it's a delicate subject, so we'll see whether that really ever happens. Here is where Mariah Syphax is buried in among with about 7 other Syphaxes. This is in Suitland, Maryland, at a cemetery called Lincoln Cemetery. I just went out there. That. Now, the other well-known individualized slaves, and that's one of the most important reasons to have modern literature on the topic of slavery, because if you read any of the biographies in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and even more recent ones, they talk about slaves rather than enslaved persons, which is an important distinction about whether this person is God made this person a slave or whether this is a human being that somebody, other human being enslaved. That's an important distinction, of course. And they also never they were called servants, which is kind of a euphemism, and they didn't really come across as individuals. They were, their loyalty was so valued, it was kind of exaggerated. And you'll see, if you read my book, that I have a lot of pretty graphic quotes from the Lee grandchildren and others living in Arlington House. And I use the word condescending, you know, there's some affection and there's some shared culture, but there's also a whole lot of superiority in the culture, and you would expect that. And, you know, with all the recent scholarship on raising awareness of the missing African-American history that they're now integrating, I thought it was important in my book to cover both cultures and show how they integrated together, and maybe not so smoothly, but that they both, you know, the people up on the hill were having their meals and the enslaved persons out in the fields were having their drama, and both are happening at one time. So the other enslaved persons from the Arlington House community that are important to remember is Selina and Thornton Gray. And after the war, he went on to a more illustrious career. She is famous and is always remarked upon by the Lee people as when the Union troops were just going up the bluff to Arlington House, that she rescued the George Washington artifacts and protected them, and which is true. And it's interesting that she appeared loyal to Mrs. Lee to the end. She's buried out, by the way, in Alexandria now, and there's a cemetery out there that I've written about. But her brother, William Norris, he had escaped from Arlington House. And he shows up in the drama a little bit later too. Here we have a drawing of the enslaved man at Arlington House named Lawrence Parks. The drawing was done by Mary Custis Lee, who did other little portraits. And his son is James Parks. And I was just on the phone today with one of James Parks' descendants. I don't think Tamara Moore is here tonight. Oh, she is. There she is. Thank you. So thank you for coming. You know, Parks is remarkable. He's well known in our community in Arlington. He's been profiled at the Central Library, and he was born into slavery at Arlington House. But then after the Civil War, he stayed around through Freedman's Village and through the revitalization of Arlington House. And he was an employee of the cemetery. And he gets interviewed by the Evening Star in 1928. He dies a year later, 1929. And he talks a lot about what it was like. And he portrays Custis as a little more gentle and more tolerant. It's interesting, you know, you can't be sure that the people feel free to speak freely, whether they're bitter or angry, and whether they resented their former masters. You know, there does exist interviews with enslaved persons who are militant and angry, and the best example is Nat Turner gave a jailhouse interview in a lot of harrowing detail. All right, let's see. Now here I wanted to just show Custis as he approaches old age, and I should talk about the American Colonization Society, and that really gives you the best insight into Custis's views on slavery. It was founded in 1816, and it attracted all sorts of mainstream, what we would call boldface names. You know, John Marshall and James Monroe and Bushrod Washington were all members, as were the presidents of the major colleges. So their agenda was to raise money to encourage enslaved African Americans or to, once they were freed, to voluntarily be deported to Africa. And that's how the country of Liberia was founded. And the capital was called Monrovia, which is named for James Monroe. And the American Colonization Society had branches all over the country. And Custis went to a lot of their annual meetings, and he spoke a lot about, he had these sort of pseudo-scientific views about climate and skin color and who was best suited for the economies in different parts of the planet. And they had this feeling that, slavery was a messy situation. It was a serpent, he would call it at one point, but in the long term, maybe blacks and whites shouldn't be living in the same country. That's sort of their view. When you think about it, it really was pretty unrealistic. I was putting it together the other day. Slavery lasted from 1619 to 1863. So that's like 250 years, odd years. And that's 10 generations. So you have people who, the memories of Africa and the remnants of African culture, which still existed to some extent in cuisine and musical instruments, for example. But most of the enslaved persons would have lived isolated rural lives of quiet desperation, and they would not have any more familiarity with Africa than a white person did in that period. So, but William Meade and the Fitzhughs, Custis's brother-in-law, Molly's brother, William Fitzhugh, they were officers in the American Colonization Society, and they were trying to get government money to fund it. And they also had a religious justification for it. And the same thing is true for teaching the enslaved persons to read. Molly and her daughter, Mary Custis Lee, famously gave schooling to the enslaved persons at Arlington House, which was against the law in Virginia in most years. I think the law changed a little bit, but it's if you read overall, I would say that Custis's views on slavery were he took a lot of cues from George Washington, tried to treat them kindly, claimed that he treated them kindly, but he never really could bring himself to abolitionism. And of course, abolitionism gets started in the mid-18th century in the churches, and it's already being debated at the Constitutional Convention. And there was Lafayette, when he and George Washington had many discussions about it. And it gathers momentum. The American Abolition Society is formed, I think, in 1832 or 3. So by then, of course, the British have already outlawed the slave trade. I think it's 1807, and then they outlawed slavery itself, 1833. So there's plenty of momentum towards abolitionism that Custis could have taken his cue from, and he decided not to. And then, of course, it's if you look at who gets elected, it was, I think, a little hard for abolitionists to get elected to public office. So that gives you a sense of where the mainstream was, I think. This is one of the last photos of, this is an actual photo. There's two of them. One of them's on the cover of my book, and this one is 1856 of Custis. Let's see. All right, well, that brings us to his will, which I reprint in the book in its entirety. It was drafted in around 1853. Custis begins losing his relatives. Nellie Custis dies 1854. His wife dies 1853. His older sister dies around then, and he finally meets his end in October 10th of 1857. This is his grave that you can see today at Arlington House, and his wife's grave is to the right of it, and this oak tree is interfering in it, and there's a fear that that oak tree is going to destroy the stones at some point, so they're trying to do something about that. Now, his funeral was attended by thousands. It got press coverage all around the world. There were military units, formations, and it's too bad that Custis had been invited not long before his death to attend an 1858 opening of Mount Vernon, which had been purchased by the first preservation group in the whole country, the all women Mount Vernon Ladies Association. He also, I should have mentioned this when I was talking about monuments too. He offered Arlington House to be the Washington Monument before the decision was made to build it downtown on the mall. And he had a minor role in that. There's a stone that he helped move that's in the monument, and then later a stone with his name on it. It's way up on like the 60th floor or something. You can't see it now. The Park Service won't let you go inside the Washington Monument anymore. You have to take the elevator. But he also, an entrepreneur had offered to buy Arlington House from him and turn it into a kind of a theme park. And he did a lot of budget estimates on that too. So when Custis dies, the will has a bit of what I call a booby trap in it. Is that he says that he wants all of his enslaved people to be freed within 5 years. And he names, there was about 6 executors, but Robert E. Lee, his son-in-law, is the main executor manager. The Arlington House property legally went to his daughter, Mary Custis Lee, but Lee, being the man of the house and the executor, was really making a lot of the decisions. And so there's this drama unfolds, which I go into in some detail with a lot of the letters quoted about. And again, at the Arlington House new exhibit, they make it very clear that the enslaved persons were given the impression from Custis on his deathbed, they say, that they were to be freed much sooner than 5 years. But Custis, what Lee was looking at is the desire of Custis to give $10,000 to each of his 7 grandchildren. So that left him in the same situation that George Washington was in, with that is that you'd like to free the slaves, but only after I'm gone because it's too expensive. And it's a crying shame of a situation. And there's disagreements over whether that promise to the enslaved persons was real or not. And there's debated in the press. And Lee, he's considers the inheritance to be a burden and the executorship. And he delays their manumission until the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862 is when he finally does it, which is only a week before the Emancipation Proclamation was to take effect. So then what happens to Custis had been writing lots of essays and historiography all through the years. And he's a pretty good writer. He's eloquent, as you know, from his plays. So when he dies, enter this Benson Lossing, who was a well-known archivist and historian who had written a lot on Mount Vernon and on the George Washington's family relics at Mount Vernon and on the battlefields of the American Revolution. And he was based in New York. And he had visited Arlington House in 1853 and done an important article in Harper's Magazine with giving the whole history of Arlington House and inventorying all the relics. And then, so Lossing, he had been buttering up Custis in his final months, saying, in so many words, I hope you don't die before you finish these memoirs. And so after he does die, then Mary Custis Lee, his daughter, and Lossing team up to edit what would become the Recollections, which was published in 1860. And it was quite filled with insights, first-time details of what it was like to grow up at Mount Vernon with George Washington. And he profiles a lot of the Revolutionary War heroes and personages. And they even reprint the correspondence when Custis was an errant student at Princeton and St. John's. It's interesting. So it has some of the warts in it too. It's not total hagiography. And then, Custis, one of the best quotes, I think, from Custis is, autograph collectors are always seeking him. Biographers of Washington consulted him all the time. And you got Jared Sparks, you got Washington Irving, you got John Marshall. They all interviewed him. And people always wanted to know who had the best capturing of George Washington's image, which portrait was most accurate. And here's what Custis wrote to a businessman in 1857. Trumble for the figure, Stuart the head, and Sharples the expression, and you have all you can have of the portraiture of Washington. So, and then Custis, you know, he had made quite an imprint on people. There was a waltz and a polka named for him that was performed at dances, and there was a steamer ship named for him and a Civil War balloon named for him. So he was still quite a personage after he died. And then I talk at the end about, there's a wonderful afterword by my friend and colleague, Matthew Penrod, who spent 28 years at Arlington House. So he brings, if you want to read the book, he'll bring you into the 21st century and how we might want to view Custis's legacy. But what my brief comments, I just talk about how he could never it's hard to imagine him imagining that the country would break up and that Robert E. Lee would fight for the South. That it's no surprise that he would mimic his hero George Washington in freeing his enslaved people only after his death. It's, you know, it's interesting that a lot of the biographies of Lee portray Custis as a softie, that Robert E. Lee was a manly man who knew how to extract, you know, productivity from the enslaved workers, whereas Custis was just, you know, it's really, you know, I don't like it to be compared to Lee that way, but I think it's true that Custis did have more sympathetic bones in his body. But I would say that he considered slavery to be a inconvenience in his life. I think that his heart lay in perpetuating the fame and memory of George Washington as a sun that never sets. And I talk about how he preserved a kind of a patriotic optimism about the country. And here's one quote he's told the Jamestown Society in one of his last speeches. If in the wildest days, the wildest man that ever was born of woman had been told that the United States of America in the short period of some 80 years would become one of the leading powers of the world and would be in a short time the mistress of the world, he would have pronounced the prophecy an idle dream. So then finally, I want to just give you a little taste of what I saw in my travels to put this book together, all the museums and archives that I visited. A friend of mine had to, using Google coordinates, had to help guide me to what exists today of the two plantations on the Potomac River, White House and Roman Coke. Roman Coke was called Roman Cock for much of its time, and Robert E. Lee changed the name because he was kind of distasteful. But this is what you see if you go down there. The one on the left is a residential neighborhood. There's a lot of suburban homes right where you're looking from. But this one on the right of Roman Coke is just a deserted former railroad track, and very little there. This is the St. Peter's Church in New Kent County, which I enjoy talking. Of course, the current day parishioners are oblivious to the whole Custis and Washington drama. They're all just being church congregants in the 21st century. But in the graveyard there is the grave of the rector who married George and Martha Washington. And they were married not at the church, they were married at White House in 1759. And then if you go to Mount Vernon, and I'm going to be speaking at Mount Vernon, by the way, on December 1st, because you know I wrote part of this book with a research fellowship with Mount Vernon, which I was pleased to get. It got kind of truncated by the pandemic, but we may do. But this is the North Garden House, and there's a sign on it that tells you that this is where young Washi was tutored by Tobias Lear, Washington's secretary, among others. So I thought that was fun. And then that's just a list of some of the places that I had to go to gather this. So that's it. We have, I guess we have about a half hour if you want to ask questions. So I prepared. Yes, sir.
I understand he was interested in the Irish.
Yes. And I think I blew past that a little too fast because I have a whole section on his speeches the Irish. A lot of the Irish were Revolutionary War soldiers, and part of that was their animosity towards the English. And they came over to the States, and Custis has several anecdotes of individuals that he knew at Mount Vernon. And he, on St. Patrick's Day, he often spoke, and the Hibernian Society would welcome him. And even in recent years, the current Hibernian Society has been putting four-leaf clovers on his grave at Arlington House. I think that's been halted, I was told. But yeah, so that is an important part. There's lots of good speeches he gives to them. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What was the relationship with Washington? Yeah, Senate, Washington. How did they do Washington?
Well, I think he's sort of frozen as the errant college student. It's interesting that, you know, the people, when I hang out with the Arlington House community, they're not as conversant in the Mount Vernon drama. When you hang out with the Mount Vernon folks, it sort of cuts off, you know, after Washington's death and Martha Washington's death. And so they don't necessarily follow him a lot. You know, all those portraits of him and Nellie are on display there. And when you enter the Mount Vernon, what do you call it? The vestibule where you go in, the lobby, I should say, of the new modern building before you go into the mansion, they have a three-dimensional statue of the first family, and it's George, Martha, Nellie, and Washi, you know, the little boy done in bronze or whatever. It's just to make sort of you feel at home, but it kind of oversimplifies what's going on there, obviously. But Washington did adopt him. The laws were a little vaguer at the time, but Washington vowed to take him on as if he and Nellie, as if they were his own children. Now, Nellie is an interesting character too, but I don't think she has any of the charm that Custis has. I mean, I print a letter from her in the book where she is so offended that William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist editor, is attacking the American Colonization Society. And right after the Nat Turner's rebellion, Nellie writes a scathing letter, you know, saying that he deserves the death sentence because he's really a threat to their whole livelihood and everything. She's, you know, do you remember George Washington bought her the land and they built the Woodlawn Plantation, which is, you know, just a few miles from Mount Vernon. And she lives sort of a spoiled life, but it's also, her life is very well documented too. There's several books on her read. So, anything else? Yes, sir.
What if you could speak about George Washington Parke Custis, War of 1812, was he in Baltimore with the mob?
Yes, that's a very good question. And for space reasons, I left that out tonight. But so one of his first speeches was a eulogy for General James Lincoln in 1812, I guess it is. So it gets into a very interesting case about freedom of the press. So it's a complicated story, but when the British were threatening, the Federalists were attacking the Madison administration in 1812 for getting us into this horrible war with the British. And so James Lincoln was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he and Light Horse Harry Lee, the future father of Robert E. Lee, were in Baltimore, and they were trying to protect a newspaper editor. And he was publishing criticisms of the Madison administration. And that inflamed other people in Baltimore. And so the two Revolutionary War veterans, Lincoln and Light Horse Harry Lee, were attacked by a mob. And Lincoln was murdered very, very violently. And so after he died, they needed an orator to give his eulogy. And their first choice was Francis Scott Key, but for some reason wasn't available. So they ended up with Custis, and that was one of his first presence on the national stage. And he gave a speech in Georgetown at a church, and it's reprinted in his recollections. And it's interesting that there was later a congressional investigation of how Lincoln was murdered. And in 1908, they transferred Lincoln's remains to Arlington Cemetery, Custis' property. I say that in a footnote. Thank you for asking that question. Yes.
He was a child when George Washington and Martha, his grandmother, adopted him. So it sounds like he was abandoned by his mother who had remarried.
Very good question.
Is that common back then?
Well,
And did he suffer as a result?
it's funny you ask that. One of the anecdotes in the book is that Custis's mother, Eleanor Calvert, had as many as 22 children. And the numbers differ, but I quote their cousin Rosalie Calvert sort of making sort of catty gossip about her, you know, sort of along the lines of when is she going to get over this, you know, stop. And so, you know, she remarries after Jackie Custis dies, and David Stewart is a wealthy politician and planner. He helped with the District of Columbia planning too. And they built a house. He had two of them, Hope Park, which is still a private home out in Fairfax off of Pope's Head Road. I've been out there. And he built another one called Ossining, which is on the campus of Annandale High School now. So she had enough on her hands, but it's funny, it's good that you raised that because she expresses some regret when Washi and Nellie are nationally famous now. They're in the first family and they're up in New York City and then in Philadelphia and becoming household names. Eleanor Calvert Stewart does write to Tobias Lear and says, you know, please remind young Washington that he has a mother, you know, so. Yes, sir. Oh, good point. Possibly the largest, certainly the most conspicuous, I would say. The largest slave owner, that's what the gentleman said. But I would like to talk about retrocession too, Guy. Thank you for raising that. So Custis was, when the district was created, immediately there was regrets from some people in Virginia saying why this diamond-shaped 10 square mile District of Columbia, which overlaps into what is today Arlington and Alexandria, was upsetting to some people already. So Custis in 1804 forms a committee to protect that arrangement. He's against what would become retrocession at this point. And they sent a letter to the Speaker of the House of Representatives saying, you can't return any land to Virginia without proper consultation, et cetera. But over the next 3 decades, he changes his mind because a lot of, the slavery issue is always lurking in the background there on retrocession. But when you study the debates and the news coverage of it, it's really more about the failure of the federal government to fund any facilities in Northern Virginia. The Alexandria Canal, for example, was built with private investment and not any congressional appropriations. So the movement to separate Alexandria County from the district gathers steam in the 30s and 40s. And by then, Custis is, there's a famous exchange. The vote is happening in Ball's Tavern, which is today Macy's in Boston. And Custis is there presiding over it. And they are resentful of some of the hoity-toity people in Old Town are not as sensitive to the rural part of Alexandria County, which is us, Arlington. And but eventually he comes around to agreeing that if the federal government is not going to help us with our roads and our military facilities, then Virginia might be better off. And of course, Custis would have known that the slave auction company on Duke Street there, the Franklin and Armfield, he would have known all about that existed in the 1820s and early 1830s. It was sold, I think, in the mid 1830s to somebody else. And so Arlington House, was very visible on the landscape and in the guidebooks. If you look at the guidebooks in the beginning in about the 1840s, but on after the Civil War, it's a strong presence there. So that was the fact that he had 60 or so enslaved persons there, I think would have been among the most visible in the area. And so Custis ends up being appointed chairman of the committee to implement retrocession. So he had the opposite view by then in 1846 and 7, which is when it was finalized. So, yes, ma'am.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is that George Washington Parke Custis was much like his father, Jackie, if I understand. Jackie didn't have a lot of energy and enthusiasm. So maybe it was great. Also curious why he was not accepted into the Society of the Cincinnati.
Well, I have my wife here who works for the Society of Cincinnati. So she probably answer it better. But so it's yeah. No, you have to be a descendant of an officer, and Jackie was an aide de camp, and it was pretty brief. And so even though he was a Marylander, and Custis was a Marylander, and it was the Maryland Society, they didn't think that was qualification enough. Am I right? Does that sound right?
And not a descendant. See, he couldn't have come in on the Washington line. And I think Jackie's service wasn't qualifying enough for society membership. You had to be a commissioned officer with 2 years of service in the Continental Line. So he really wasn't eligible. And there is such a thing as honorary membership. And I don't think his name came up for that. But he did lend his tent to them when they entertained Lafayette at Fort McHenry, the Maryland branch of the society. He did everything he could to get in their good graces. But Charlie did have access to these usually not open archives of the Maryland branch of the society, which was very interesting to see what he found.
Well, thank you for that question. And I can also fill in some detail. One of the other ironies of these letters between George Washington and the errant student Custis was that this pattern repeated what happened with his own father. That when John Parke Custis, Jackie, was a student at King's College, which became Columbia University in New York City, he was messing around and not studying too. And there was other tensions. His sister, Martha, called Patsy, dies of epilepsy right around then, mid 70s. And Jackie was very insensitive when he wrote a letter about it. Instead of expressing condolences to Martha, he talked more about his own issues at college and stuff. So yeah, I think Jackie, they're both kind of spoiled, is the impression I get here in 2021. So. Any more? Yes, sir.
I've been interested in the conversation between Custis and Marquis. Is there sufficient, do they still exist in sufficient volume that they could be combined and published in a pamphlet of some sort?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I met a gentleman in the Society of Cincinnati who said he was planning to try and do that. There's also some disagreement over how many there were. I figured out about 16, but when you read the news clippings, they say in the national intelligence they had planned 24 installments or something. So I haven't been able to put them all together. But by the way, I did a lot of my research using the Genealogy Bank news archives, and you sign up, pay them an annual fee. And there's also Virginia Chronicles has a lot of the 19th century newspapers down in Richmond, all online. I ended up with over 150 news clippings that dealt with Custis's life. And that would have been a lot harder to do before the internet. So that's another reason to have a modernized biography of Custis. Yeah. But yeah, that would be an interesting project, and some academic ought to do it. The Conversations of Lafayette.
Doesn't have to be an academic.
Yeah, I know. Yes, Michael.
After the Civil War, well, during the Civil War, the Union Army took control of Arlington, the Arlington estate. And the Lees were disinherited the property. Were they ever compensated for that?
Yes. So,
Well,
go ahead. You want to continue?
How? And was there an act of Congress?
Supreme Court, Custis Lee is this grandson of George Washington Parke Custis, and he's the eldest son of Robert E. Lee. And he was sort of put in charge of Arlington when in the late 1850s, when Lee, although he was in California a lot too, because he had his own military service. He was at the Presidio, my understanding. But there are letters from Robert E. Lee to his son Custis Lee, tasking him with keeping track of certain things at Arlington House. Remember, Lee was on the road a lot. He marries in 1831, but they immediately go to Port Comfort, which is Fort Monroe, and they go to St. Louis, and they go to Brooklyn, Fort Hamilton. And then Lee was in the Mexican War, 1848. So he considered Arlington House to be his real home, but he was very seldom there. So back to your question, Michael. So Mary Custis Lee, Lee dies, I think, 1870. Mary Custis Lee dies in about 1873, if I have that right. And they never got to return to Arlington House. So Custis Lee in the 1880s went to court on the issue about, it had to do with whether she had paid the taxes in person or not. And so the Supreme Court ruled that the Lee family deserved some restitution in the 1880s, if I have that right. So, the literature of Robert E. Lee is much vaster than the literature of Custis. So when I started out, I was trying to focus, and I was trying to just focus on Custis himself. But the more I got into it, the more I realized that I do need to master some of the surrounding territory, such as the Lee family and what happened after the Civil War, that kind of stuff. So, but I don't have that kind of thing in my book. Is the difference, I think. So, yeah. Anything else? Okay. All right.